Hi.
Hi. I wanted to start by saying thank you, first of all, for doing the interview that we did 14 months ago. It's given this interview in the shape of the film, Power and Terror, has given many thousands of people an opportunity to think about what's going on in the world with a lot greater depth and perspective and engagement. We estimate that probably 100,000 people have seen the film in Japan and the United States, Australia, Canada, and now in Europe. And it's still playing a year after it was finished to standing room only audiences. I'd like to start by asking you, now that 14 months have passed, a lot of events have taken place.
The invasion of Iraq was actually a piece of a much bigger picture. When we talked 14 months ago, we probably didn't talk much about it. The reason is that the great government media propaganda campaign about Iraq being an imminent threat to the survival of the United States, that began in September, a couple of months after we talked. And it coincided with two other crucial events. One was the announcement of the National Security Strategy on September 17th, which is not entirely without precedent, but it is something new. The Bush administration declared, quite frankly and brazenly, that they intend, the United States, their version of the United States, intends to dominate the world completely and permanently. That is, any potential challenge will be blocked and, if necessary, destroyed by the use of military force. The one dimension of power, and this is crucial, it's the one dimension of power in which the U.S. has overwhelming advantages. That's not true economically, and it's not true in other respects. It's a more complicated world. But militarily, the United States is in a class by itself, and it wants to use this. It's expanding its military force enormously in extremely hazardous ways, which are worth looking at. And the intention is to use that advantage to control the world. So that was announced in September. When you announce a policy, you have to carry out, if you want it to be taken seriously, you have to carry out what's sometimes called an exemplary action to demonstrate that you really mean it. And Iraq was chosen to be the test case, what the New York Times later called the Petri dish, in which the strategy is tried. Now, Iraq was a very sensible test case. To be a test case for this strategy, a country has to meet several conditions. One is it must be completely defenseless. It doesn't make any sense to attack anybody who can fight back. That's ridiculous. So it has to be defenseless, which of course Iraq was. It's one of the weakest countries in the region. It's devastated by sanctions. Its military expenditures were about a third of Kuwait's, which has 10% of its population. It was under complete surveillance. They knew where every pocket knife in the country was. So it was completely defenseless. That's point one. Secondly, it has to be important. There's no point intervening in, say, conquering Liberia. What are you going to do with it? Actually, it has some reasons, but not much. Iraq's extremely important. It's the second largest reserves of oil in the world. The United States will end up dominating a major sector of the hugest energy reserve in the world. It's dominated it for a long time, but this will advance it. This will, presumably, the U.S. will end up with military bases in Iraq. It's part of the shift of military bases towards the oil-producing regions. And that'll be the first real military base right in the oil-producing region, so that's very important. And third, you have to be able to portray the country as somehow the ultimate evil or threatening our existence or something like that. And that's possible too. All we have to do is listen to every speech by George Bush or Tony Blair, and they say, how can we let somebody survive who gassed his own population and invaded two countries and was developing weapons of mass destruction and so on, all of which is completely true, but it always omits the few crucial words. Yeah, he did all that, and we helped him. And we helped him because we didn't care. And we is the people now running Washington. And there was a third thing in September, namely the opening of the midterm election campaign. And that's connected. Karl Rove, the Republican campaign manager, one of the most important people in Washington, informed the party activists over the summer that if they go into the campaign and allow social and economic issues to be in the forefront, they're going to lose, because the social and economic policies are very harmful to most of the population and are very unpopular. So he said we have to focus the campaign on security. If you can frighten the population, they may rally around the man presented as the powerful leader who'll protect you from destruction, and then maybe we can hold on to political power. And that's exactly what was done. So you had those three things at once: the national security strategy, announcing a plan to dominate the world permanently by force if necessary, the test case, invade a defenseless country that's worth controlling, and three, try to maintain a narrow hold, very narrow hold on political power, so that they can ram through a extremely reactionary domestic agenda, which is basically rolling back the progressive legislation of the past century, literally, and very consciously, and serving the interests of very narrow sectors of power, very unpopular, but you can get away with it if you can frighten people. Iraq was used to frighten the population, and it worked. There was a major government media campaign. Within about a month, about 60% of the population thought that Iraq was a threat to an imminent threat to the United States. We had to defend ourselves from it. Around the world, that's laughable. Even Kuwait didn't believe that. In fact, no one did. But in the United States, it worked. Within a couple of months more, about half the population or more came to believe that Iraq was responsible for September 11th, and that it's planning new terrorist attacks. And these views, as you'd expect, are very closely correlated with support for war, and that's understandable. I mean, if people think that there's this monstrous country about to destroy us, it already carried out the September 11th attacks and it's planning new ones, well, we got to defend ourselves. So that way they could get some support for war, not a lot, but some. It's hard to say. This is a very public relations-oriented administration. I mean, all administrations are, but this one unusually so. Every figure is carefully crafted, coming out of central casting with a particular role. And what they will, the Abraham Lincoln extravaganza is just a case in point. What they will probably do is just what Karl Rove indicated, create another extremely manufacture a dangerous situation. It doesn't take much to manufacture. It doesn't have to be real, like Iraq would. Whatever you think of it, it was certainly no threat. But they were able to convince the country that it was a very serious threat, and if they have another one, then somehow the problems in Iraq people will forget about. Does anybody remember what happened in Afghanistan or Kosovo? You don't even know what they were. This goes way back, incidentally. I mean, when my children were in elementary school, around 1960, they were literally being taught to hide under their school desks to protect them from atom bombs. I mean, putting aside the absurdity, is there any other country where school children were being taught to hide from atom bombs? There's been major efforts here for years to frighten the population into obedience, and people are afraid of everything. They're afraid of aliens. Very large part of the population in the United States, maybe half, some large number, thinks there already are aliens among us, and they're going to try to destroy us. I mean, there's fear of the UN. There are large parts of the country where people are afraid that the UN is planning a genocide against the American people, and reports of black helicopters with UN troops and so on. This is unique to the United States as far as I'm aware, and unscrupulous leaders can manipulate it. Crime, drugs, Nicaragua, Grenadian Air Base, Saddam Hussein, whatever it'll be next. But there are real issues in the background. It's not just controlling the American population that's required. You also have to control the world. There are, for 30 years now, the world has been economically what's called tripolar, 3 major economic centers, more or less on a par. Europe, North America, and Japan-based Asia. That was 30 years ago. It's changed since. It's now not just Japan-based, it's China-based and so on. But these 3 areas are still there. If you look at the 3 of them, Northeast Asia is the most dynamic economic region in the world. Fastest growth, big industrial powers, Japan, China, South Korea, China becoming Japan, South Korea already major industrial powers, plenty of resources. Siberia has lots of energy and other resources. It's a potentially integrated area. It actually holds about half the world's foreign reserves. So just in that respect, it's the most important of the 3 major areas. It's the gross domestic product. Northeast Asia is much higher than that of the United States, and it's growing fast. The United States is concerned about it. They're concerned about the integration of Northeast Asia. The North Korean issue is right in the center of this. And similar problems are arising in Europe. All of this talk about old Europe, France and Germany, we can get rid of them. That reflects fears that go back to the end of the Second World War, that Europe might move on an independent course. And if it does, it's going to be led by its industrial and financial heartland, namely Germany and France. Germany and France were bitterly condemned because the governments took the same position as the large majority of the population instead of following orders from Washington. In fact, the hatred of democracy that was expressed in the last few months has absolutely no parallel that I know of. In fact, the hatred of democracy that was expressed in the last few months has absolutely no parallel that I know of. I mean, the countries that were praised, New Europe, the population was even more opposed to the war than in old Europe. But the leadership was willing to follow orders from Crawford, Texas, so that made them good guys. They had democratic credentials. They were following orders from us, but disregarding maybe 80 or 90% of the population. If there's ever been an expression of hatred of democracy like this in the past, I haven't seen it. And there's no certainty that Europe and Northeast Asia can be controlled. Asia is moving towards integration south, what's called ASEAN +3, Southeast Asia plus the 3 industrial powers to the north are also moving in an independent direction. And if you look at a longer stretch of history, it's not at all surprising. I go back a couple hundred years, and the major commercial and industrial centers of the world were East Asia, South and East Asia, India and China, Japan, even Japan. But that's kind of reconstructing, and the United States doesn't like it at all. For example, if Northeast Asia becomes integrated in terms of energy resources, so pipelines from Siberia to China and Japan, maybe through North Korea into South Korea, it'll have much less dependence on Middle East oil. The U.S. wants to control Middle East oil as a lever of world control. It's not that the U.S. needs the oil, probably doesn't, but it wants to control it. It wants to make sure that 50 years ago, George Kennan, top planner, said that control over Middle East oil gives us veto power over Japan's potential, at that time, potential industrial and military actions. Didn't take it seriously, but could happen. And control over Middle East oil and over the pipelines gives the United States the transatlantic, the shipping lanes that gives the U.S. Very significant control over the countries of the region, but not if they develop their own integrated resource-based industrial development, which is right on the horizon. And it's just as in Europe. So it's not simply a matter of controlling the population of the United States. Controlling the world is not an easy matter. I mean, North Korea is a pretty crazy place, but they're making it reasonably clear that they would trade security guarantees for a reduction of their very threatening military development. That would mean a security guarantee from the, I mean, what they're asking for isn't that crazy. A non-aggression agreement from the United States, economic assistance, all of that makes sense, and it's a way of maybe moving towards slowly integrating North Korea into the region in a healthier fashion, leading, one hopes, to changes internally, which will open the place up politically and economically and so on. It's a long process, but that's the way to do it. The alternative is pretty frightening. Recent task force just published a study called The Road to Perdition, headed by Zolik Harrison, well-known Asia specialist. The confrontational policy, they say, is a road to perdition. It's going to lead to disaster. But there are possibilities for diplomatic, economic initiatives, a kind of sunshine policy initiatives, which are not without prospects and certainly should be pursued. And it's striking that the United States is taking a different stand from the regional countries in this respect. Not totally, but different. And I suspect that a lot of what lies behind it is the concern that if there is a peaceful diplomatic settlement, it will be a spur towards integration. I mean, North Korea isn't that important geopolitically, but it's not of null importance either. I mean, gas pipelines and extension of the Trans-Siberian Railroad through North Korea into the south would be another step towards bringing the region into closer integration as a tying together its resource base and its industrial capacity. And I think the United States is not happy about that prospect. Meanwhile, the U.S. is shifting its military basing system from Central Europe towards the Middle East and Central Asia. So bases are moving from Germany to Bulgaria and Romania. The U.S., one of the main results of the Afghan war from the U.S.'s point of view, probably the major result, is that the U.S. ends up with a strong military position in Central Asia, which is a benefit to U.S. corporations in the so-called great game as to who controls its resources, but also, more important than that, help surround the far more significant Persian Gulf energy system, which is the main one in the world. The U.S. basing system, military basing system from Okinawa and Guam up to the Azores has been focused to a large extent on the Middle East. And the same is true of the Central European ones. Now that's moving closer to the region. Until the Afghan war, the U.S. had only one reliable military base near the Persian Gulf, namely the British island of Diego Garcia. The population was kicked out. The British courts ordered the government to allow them to return, but the U.S. just refused, said won't. So that's a military base, but that's a small base in the middle of the ocean. Now they've got bases in Afghanistan, in Central Asia, and probably pretty soon in Iraq, surrounding ones in Eastern Europe. It's moving towards the region that's of crucial significance for strategic domination of the world. You know, I hate to talk about Japan. People know a lot more about it than I do. But Japan, it's pretty clear from observing from a distance that there's a kind of a split developing. And the policy is moving in a rightward militaristic direction. On the other hand, the population is clearly much more open and free than it was before. For example, discussions like this 5 or 10 years ago in Japan would have been very unlikely. I should say, I've been visiting Japan for some 40 years now, and until recently, it was the only country in the world, I travel in a lot of countries, it's the only one where I was never asked to give political talks or have political interviews. I have plenty of interviews, but they're on professional topics and professional talks and so on. That's changed a lot in the last couple of years. So that's, from what it looks like to me, one direction. On the other hand, if you look at policies, it's going the other direction, which is like the United States. The United States is much more open than it was a couple of years ago. So huge audiences, tremendous demand, and so on. On the other hand, policy is shifting so far to the right that positions that were regarded as outlandish a couple of years ago are right in the middle of the spectrum today. Well, what we were talking about, I mean, the populations of the world, in my opinion at least, are becoming much more civilized, much more concerned about things, looking into issues seriously, acting about them. I mean, there's very important developments in the world which we haven't discussed, like the opposition to the war in Iraq is completely without precedent. There has never, in history of Europe and the United States at least, been such massive protest against a war before it was launched. You know, it takes years usually. The global justice movements are, again, have no precedent. They're international. There's a lot of international solidarity, North-South solidarity. They're dedicated to serious issues. They're working hard. I mean, these are very promising developments. I mean, basically, there are two trajectories in the world. There's one towards war, destruction, repression, demolition of progressive achievements, and so on. That's very clear. There's another that's going quite in the opposite direction. And it's just a question which one will prevail. We're not going to have a lot of time to answer that question. The survival of the species is a fragile matter at this point. Somebody, again, observing this from Mars would not put very high odds on human survival.
So it's up to us to make it happen.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.